"Give me the rifle." The commander pressed his boot onto the wounded American's chest and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a slow, satisfied laugh, like a man who had just won something he'd been waiting for. He grabbed the soldier by the collar, looked him in the eyes, and said in broken English, "No one is coming for you." Then he raised his radio and called the order. "Surround them. Finish them all. Every last one." He turned his back on the burning helicopter like it was already a grave. He never looked at the woman kneeling in the dust behind him. He never saw her reach for the fallen rifle. That was his first mistake, and his last. Before this day was over, she would pick up a rifle she had never trained to use in combat, and she would make him regret that smile. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Nobody ever asked Aninssley Grant what she wanted to be when she grew up. Not her recruiters, not her commanding officers, not the logistics chain of command that handed her a clipboard and pointed her toward a row of ammunition crates in the broiling heat of Forward Operating Base Griffin. They had looked at her file, seen her scores, seen her background, and put her exactly where the numbers said she belonged. Efficient, organized, detail-oriented. Those were the words they used, and those were the walls they built around her. She was 24 years old, 137 pounds, and she could tell you within 30 seconds how many 5.56 rounds were left in any given supply pallet on that base. She could account for every piece of ordnance, every fragmentation grenade, every belt of linked ammunition that came through Griffin's resupply chain. She had never fired a weapon at a living human being. She had never been asked to, and for a long time, she told herself that was fine. The base sat in a valley that seemed designed to trap heat. By 9 in the morning, the air was already shimmering above the gravel, and by noon, the metal walls of the supply depot became hot enough to raise blisters on exposed skin. Aninssley had learned to work in the early hours before the sun got full purchase, moving between the pallets with her tablet and her pen, cross-referencing numbers, flagging discrepancies, sending reports up the chain. It was precise work. It was important work. She knew that. She repeated it to herself on the hard days, the days when she watched convoys roll out through the gate and felt something pull in her chest that she couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy, she decided. It wasn't some naive hunger for glory. It was something quieter and more honest than that. It was the feeling of a person who knew they had more in them than the job was asking for. She was in the middle of a recount on a case of 40mm grenade rounds when she first saw them. 4 men moving across the base with a kind of deliberate efficiency that was different from the regular army walk she'd grown used to. They didn't swagger. They didn't hurry. They moved like people who had already done the math on everything around them and found none of it particularly surprising. Their gear was different too, worn in ways that spoke of actual use rather than garrison maintenance. Patches that didn't match the conventional unit identifiers she was used to seeing. She went back to her count. "You the supply specialist?" The voice came from directly behind her, and it was even, unhurried, with a quality to it that suggested the man asking the question already knew the answer and was asking as a courtesy. She turned around. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone, and eyes that were a very specific shade of pale gray that she would later describe as the color of sky just before a storm rolls in. He was wearing body armor over a tan shirt, and there was dust on everything he owned. The kind of fine talcum dust that got into the creases of your hands and stayed there no matter how many times you washed. "Specialist Grant?" she said. "Yes." "Lieutenant Garrett," he said. He didn't extend a hand, not because he was being rude, but because his hands were full of a folded piece of paper he was already opening. "We're running a 2-day package out of here. We need someone who can manage our resupply load and ride along for ammo accountability. Your CO says you're the best he's got." "Where?" she asked. He looked at her. Not through her, the way a lot of officers looked at enlisted personnel, but actually at her, taking her in the way you'd take in terrain before deciding whether to cross it. Kandahar province, he said, hard country. I know where it is. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the register of a fact he found worth noting. We leave at 0400 tomorrow. It's volunteer only. You don't have to come. He said it flat, without pressure, without the recruitment poster voice that some officers used when they were trying to make you feel like you'd be a coward for saying no. He just said it, the way you'd tell someone the temperature outside. Aninssley looked at the crate in front of her. She looked at the rows of pallets behind it. She looked at the tablet in her hand with its spreadsheet columns and its neat little inventory fields. I'll be there at 0330, she said. He nodded once, took the paper back, and walked away. She stood there for a moment after he left, and the pull in her chest was still there. But it was different now. It had weight. It had direction. She went back to counting, but the numbers felt different. The rest of that day moved with the particular slowness of time before something significant happens. She finished her inventory, submitted her reports, and spent 3 hours in the supply room pulling together a field kit, ammunition loadout, medical supplies, communications gear, the kind of carefully organized package that she could manage and distribute under stress. She had rehearsed this kind of prep in her head 100 times. Now she was doing it for real. Corporal Denny Ruiz found her at around 1800 hours, leaning against the supply room doorframe with his arms crossed, and an expression on his face that she had come to recognize as his version of concern. So it's true, he said. What's true? You're going out with the SEALs tomorrow. Logistics support, she said without looking up. Aninssley. He said her name the way a person says a name when they need you to stop what you're doing and look at them. She did. Those guys are going after somebody. Not a patrol, not a presence mission. Somebody specific. You understand the difference? I'm not an idiot, Denny. I know you're not an idiot. That's why I'm confused why you're doing this. She zipped the last pouch on the field pack and set it upright. Because I was asked, she said, and because I can do it. He was quiet for a moment. You know what happens out there, he said. It's not like the base. I know what out there is. You've never been in a firefight. The words sat between them in the warm air of the supply room. She let it sit. No, she said, I haven't. And that doesn't bother you? She thought about it, really thought about it the way she did with numbers, turning the thing over and looking at its angles. Fear was there, yes. She could feel it, low and steady, like a background hum. But underneath it, something else. Something that had no good name, but felt like a door she'd been standing in front of for a long time. It bothers me less than staying here, she said. Ruiz uncrossed his arms. He shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've run out of arguments but haven't changed their mind. You're going to get yourself killed chasing something. Or I'm going to come back, she said. Those are both possible outcomes. He left, and she finished packing. And she didn't sleep that night except in short, restless intervals. And when the alarm went off at 3 a.m., she was already awake. She arrived at the staging area at 0325. Garrett was there. So were 3 others. A compact, serious man named Chief Torres, who barely acknowledged her arrival. A taller man with close-cropped red hair and a pair of binoculars around his neck, who introduced himself only as Sullivan. And a younger operator named Beckett, who looked at her field pack with an expression of genuine assessment. She put that together herself? Beckett asked no one in particular. Apparently, Garrett said, that's a good loadout. She didn't say anything. She had learned a long time ago that the moments right before something important were not the time for conversation. They went over the mission parameters in the last hour before departure. Garrett laid it out clean and fast. They were inserting by helicopter to a landing zone approximately 4 kilometers from a compound in Panjwai district. The target was a mid-level facilitator named Hamid Roshan, who had been moving weapons and IED components through 3 provinces for the better part of 2 years. The timeline was tight. The intelligence window was narrow. They would move fast, take the compound, and extract. "What's your role, Grant?" Torres asked. It wasn't hostile. It was the question of a man who needed to know exactly what each piece of his operation was capable of. "Ammunition management and resupply," she said. "I keep track of what every person on this team is carrying, what they've expended, what they need. I can load and prep any weapon system we're taking with us. I can manage casualty care supplies if needed, and I don't get in the way." Torres looked at her for a long moment. "Can you shoot?" "I qualified expert on the M4, she said. "I've put rounds downrange a few times since then. I'm not going to be your first line of defense, but I'm not going to be a liability either." He nodded, not warmly, but with the specific economy of a professional who had heard what he needed to hear. Sullivan, the sniper, had said nothing through any of this. He was checking his rifle, running his hands over it in the careful, almost meditative way that weapon handlers develop over years of practice. It was a bolt-action M110, and he treated it with the kind of quiet reverence that some people reserved for religious objects. She noticed his hands. They were absolutely steady. The helicopter came in at 0400 exactly, and they boarded in the dark, and the base fell away beneath them into a grid of amber lights, and the desert opened up all around. She had been in helicopters before. Supply runs, medevacs, the occasional transport, but this was different in a way she felt rather than understood. The men around her were in a state that wasn't quite stillness and wasn't quite tension. It was something between the two, a coiled readiness that she could sense without being able to articulate, like being in a room with a spring that hasn't released yet. Garrett was watching the terrain through his window. Torres had his eyes closed, which she suspected was not sleep, but something more calculated. Beckett was doing something with a piece of cord that might have been a knot exercise or might have been habit. Sullivan caught her looking at his rifle, which she hadn't meant to make obvious. "First time running with an element?" he asked, not unkindly. "First time outside the wire on anything like this," she said honestly. He nodded. "It's different," he said. "Not worse necessarily, just different. The noise is different. The time moves different. Don't fight it. Let your training do the work." "What if my training doesn't cover what's happening?" He looked at her with those steady eyes. "Then you think," he said. "That's what you do when the training runs out. You think. Most people can do it. They just don't know it until they have to." She thought about that. She filed it away. The flight was 40 minutes. For most of it, she checked and rechecked the inventory in her head, running through the loadout by memory, confirming the distribution, the weight balance, the accessibility of critical items. It was her version of what Torres was doing with his eyes closed. It was the thing she knew how to do, the ritual that made the hands steady. The helicopter began to descend, and then the world came apart. The sound was enormous, a flat, massive bang that she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears, and the aircraft lurched sideways with a violence that threw everyone against their harnesses, and she saw fire through the window, orange and immediate, and the rotors changed their sound to something grinding and wrong, and Garrett was shouting into his headset, and Torres had his eyes open now and was gripping the frame of the helicopter with both hands, and the descent that had been measured and controlled became something else entirely. "RPG! RPG! We're hit!" The pilot's voice cracking through the intercom. The second impact came 3 seconds later. The helicopter dropped. Aninssley Grant did not scream. Later, she would not be able to explain why not, only that there was no room for it, that the part of her brain that managed fear seemed to step aside for the part of her brain that managed problems. And the problem in front of her was this: they were going down, and when they hit the ground, she needed to be functional. She checked her harness. She tucked her chin. She gripped the supply pack between her feet. The ground came up fast. The impact was like being hit by a truck from below. a single colossal concussion that traveled up through the airframe into her spine and rattled every thought out of her head for a single blinding second. Then sound came back. Dust, shouting, the groan of metal settling, the smell of burning fuel and hot metal. She released her harness before she fully understood she was doing it. "Grant, are you functional?" Garrett's voice right next to her ear. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Get your kit. We're outside in 30 seconds. Move." She moved. She pulled the supply pack. She checked her sidearm. She followed Beckett through the side door of the helicopter and into the dust-thick air of the Afghan morning. And the first shots came 2 seconds after her boots hit the ground. A cracking, splitting sound from the ridgeline to the north, close enough that she felt the displaced air near her left ear. Someone was shooting at them. They were alive, for now. Torres was already behind a low rock outcropping, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. Garrett was on the radio, voice tight and clipped, calling in their position, calling in contact, calling for support. Beckett was moving to the right, using the wreckage of the helicopter as cover. Sullivan was 20 feet from her, on one knee behind a berm of scrub and loose earth, and he was setting up his rifle with a speed and precision that looked almost choreographed. His hands were still steady. Even now, even with rounds snapping through the air above their heads. She got behind cover, a section of the fuselage that had separated on impact, and she opened the supply pack and began to work. This was what she knew. This was the thing she was here for. She pulled ammunition, sorted it by type, began moving it toward the people who needed it. Beckett took a fresh magazine from her without breaking his position and nodded once, sharply. Torres glanced back at her, and something in his expression changed slightly. Not surprise exactly, more like reassessment. She got back behind cover. Garrett finished his transmission and looked at her. "We've got 12 to 15 hostiles on that ridge," he said. "Support is 45 minutes minimum. We hold until then." 45 minutes. She did the math on the ammunition. They had enough if everyone was careful, if no one got hurt, if the numbers held. The numbers almost never held. "Understood," she said, and the firefight began in earnest. For the first 20 minutes, it was sound and movement in the particular tunnel vision focus of a person doing a job under extreme duress. She moved ammunition. She managed inventory. She watched the men around her work with a focused professionalism that was almost awe-inspiring. The economy of motion, the communication that happened in glances and hand signals, the way they seemed to share a single operational mind even without speaking. Sullivan was extraordinary. She had read about snipers. She had seen the equipment, processed the supply requests, filed the range reports. But watching Sullivan work was something else entirely. He was motionless except for his breathing, and his breathing was so controlled it was barely visible. He watched the ridge through his scope with a patience that bordered on supernatural, and when he fired, the effect was immediate and decisive. A hostile position that had been producing steady fire simply stopped. "Good shot," Garrett said quietly. "2 more on the left slope," Sullivan said, not looking up from the scope. 30 seconds. He was right about both the number and the time. She kept moving ammunition. She kept counting. She kept the pack organized and accessible. And then Sullivan said something that made the floor fall out of her world. Not words, actually. It was a sound. A sharp, involuntary exhale. The kind that a person makes when something happens to their body that they didn't ask for. She looked up. He was down. Not down as in prone and working. Down as in crumpled. As in the rifle had fallen sideways off the berm. As in his hands were pressed against the left side of his torso, and his face had gone a color that didn't belong on a living person. She was moving before she had decided to move. "Sullivan's hit," she shouted. "How bad?" Garrett, from 15 feet away, pinned behind a different piece of cover. She reached him. She pulled his hands away from the wound and looked. Her medical training, basic, combat, lifesaver level, but there, clicked into place like a switch being thrown. Entry wound, lower left torso, no visible exit, no arterial spray, which was the best possible news under the circumstances. "He's alive," she said, "not arterial. I can stabilize him." "Do it," Garrett said. And Grant, his voice had a quality to it she hadn't heard before. Urgency, yes, but something underneath it that might have been the first edge of desperation. "Without Sullivan on that ridge, they're going to push our left. We need eyes and a rifle up there in the next 2 minutes, or we're going to start losing people." She was pressing a hemostatic dressing against Sullivan's wound. He was conscious, but barely, and his eyes were tracking her with a clouded focus. "The rifle," he said. His voice was thin. "Someone has to—" "I know," she said. "Beckett can't move from the right," Garrett said. It wasn't an order. It was a statement of fact. "Torres is holding our center. I'm on comms. There's nobody else." She looked at Sullivan's M110, lying on the berm where it had fallen. She thought about what Sullivan had told her on the helicopter. "When the training runs out, you think." She finished securing the dressing. She looked at Sullivan. His eyes found hers. "Can you talk me through it?" she asked. His lips moved. She thought for a moment he was going to say no, that it was too much, that she didn't have enough, that there was no version of this where an ammunition specialist became a sniper in the middle of a firefight. Instead, he said, "Scope's already set for the ridge, 400 meters. Don't fight the recoil. Let it come." She picked up the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, and exactly as heavy as it needed to be. And she settled into the prone position behind the berm with a certainty that had no logical basis, but felt, in that moment, as solid as anything she had ever known. The ridge was right there in the scope, clear, close, real. From somewhere behind her, she heard Garrett's voice, low and controlled and carrying everything that was riding on the next 60 seconds. "Grant, if you've got a shot, take it." Her breathing slowed. Her hands were steady. She found the first target, the world narrowed to a circle of glass and crosshairs, in a ridge 400 meters away that was trying to kill everyone she knew. She had never done this before. Not like this. Not with lives hanging on the outcome. Not with a man bleeding out 2 feet behind her and 3 operators holding a perimeter that was shrinking by the minute. Everything she knew about precision shooting came from a qualification range at Fort Bragg, and an afternoon she'd spent letting Sullivan walk her through the basics of his rifle on a dead afternoon at Griffin. A conversation that had started as curiosity and ended as something she could not have predicted she would ever need. She needed it now. The first target moved along the ridge, a figure shifting between 2 rocks, confident in his cover, not expecting what was coming from this new angle. She tracked him, let her breath out, slow, steady, let the crosshair settle. She pressed the trigger. The rifle fired. The recoil came back into her shoulder exactly the way Sullivan had described, and she let it move her instead of fighting it, and she was back on scope in under 2 seconds. The figure on the ridge was gone. "Contact down," Garrett said from behind her. His voice was different now, still controlled, but different. She was already moving the scope to the left, looking for the second position Sullivan had identified before he went down. 2 men, he had said. Left slope. She found the rock formation. She found the gap between the boulders where a shooter could lie prone and have a clear field of fire to their position. There was a muzzle there. She could see the flash. She aimed 2 inches left of the flash and fired. The muzzle disappeared. "That's 2, Beckett called from the right flank. He sounded surprised. He was trying not to sound surprised and not quite succeeding. From behind her, barely audible over the ring in her ears, she heard Sullivan's voice. "Good. You're good." She didn't stop to process that. She kept scanning. The firefight had shifted. She could feel it in the quality of the incoming fire. It had been rhythmic and confident 3 minutes ago. the cadence of attackers who believed they were winning. Now it was reactive, shorter bursts, more movement between shots. People who were no longer sure where the threat was coming from. That was the goal. Make them uncertain. Make them move. Moving targets were harder to coordinate. Uncertainty cost them time. And time was the one resource that Garrett needed more than any other. 40 minutes, he called out. That was how long until support arrived. 40 minutes was a very long time. She picked up a third target at the 260-meter mark, a man who had made the mistake of silhouetting himself against the lighter rock when he stood to reposition. She fired, he went down. She didn't think about what that meant, not yet. Later. She would think about it later, when there was a later to think in. Torres's voice from the center. Left flank's pulling back. Whatever she's doing, keep doing it. She kept doing it. Behind her, she was aware of Garrett moving. He had shifted from the radio to a position where he could cover the approach from the south, because something was developing down there that she didn't have eyes on. She heard him fire 3 times in quick succession. She heard him reload. South side, he said tersely. 4, maybe 5. They're trying to flank.
Beckett, Torres said. I see them, Beckett replied, already moving.
The team was adapting. They were still in serious trouble, but they were adapting. And adaptation was the thing that kept people alive when everything else went wrong. She found another target on the ridge. Fired. Missed. The man had moved at the last second, dropped behind cover with a speed that spoke of experience. She adjusted her breathing, recalibrated, found him again when he shifted to look for her. Fired. He didn't shift again. 8 minutes into the firefight, the incoming fire from the ridgeline dropped by more than half. They're regrouping, Sullivan said from behind her. She had almost forgotten he was there until the words came, strained but coherent. He was using the pain to stay focused, she realized, filing it somewhere else, paying attention to the fight because it was the only thing he could do. What does that mean? She asked, not taking her eye from the scope. It means they're going to change their approach, he said. They've lost too many shooters on the ridge. They're going to try something different. How long do we have? 3 minutes, maybe 4. She did the math on the ammunition. She had fired 6 rounds from Sullivan's rifle. There were 12 left in the magazine. She had 4 additional magazines in the supply pack, within arm's reach. She had been managing their supply for Garrett and the others too, and the numbers were tight but workable. If the pace of fire stayed manageable, Garrett came back on the radio. She could hear the controlled urgency in his voice as he spoke to someone she couldn't hear. The support element, she assumed, tracking their progress. When he came off the radio, his voice was flat and even, which she had come to understand was his version of bad news delivered professionally. There's a technical coming up from the valley, he said. Truck with a mounted gun. ETA 6 minutes. A technical. A pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed. An entirely different class of problem from the rifles on the ridge. The kind of weapon that could go through the wreckage they were using as cover, like it wasn't there. She heard Torres swear. Just once, quietly. The word of a man confronting math he didn't like. Options? Torres asked. We move, Garrett said. Or we find a way to stop the truck before it gets into range. She looked through the scope. The valley below them was visible from her position on the berm. A long, pale stretch of road that wound between the hills. She could see dust rising in the distance. Moving dust. Getting closer. I can see it, she said. Silence for a beat. Then Garrett, can you hit it at this range? She measured the distance in her head. The truck was moving. Moving targets required lead calculation, accounting for the speed and direction of movement, adjusting the point of aim ahead of the target so that the bullet and the truck arrived at the same place at the same time. It was the most technically demanding shot in precision shooting. She had never done it on a moving vehicle. She had read about it. She had heard Sullivan talk about it. She had processed the training manuals that described the mathematics of it. I don't know, she said. That was the honest answer. What's your confidence level? Garrett asked. The question was not rhetorical. He was making a calculation. He needed real information. 60% on the driver, she said. Lower on the gun system. If you miss, they know exactly where we are. Another beat. She could almost hear the decision being made. Take the shot when you're ready, Garrett said. Your call. Her call. She tracked the truck through the scope. It was bouncing on the road, moving fast, maybe 40 kilometers an hour. She estimated the distance at 600 meters and dropping. She calculated the lead. She steadied her breathing. She found the rhythm of the truck's movement and tried to become part of it, to let her aim move with it rather than chasing it. 550 meters. 500. She fired. The truck swerved violently. She saw it fishtail on the road, the rear end swinging wide, and for a moment it seemed like it was going to roll. It didn't roll. It stopped. The door opened and a figure got out. The driver, she realized, which meant she hadn't hit the driver. She had hit a tire. Trucks stopped, Beckett said, but the gun's still active. They're going to dismount and set up. How far? Torres asked. 470 meters. Grant. I see it. She was already adjusting. The truck had stopped at an angle that put the gun mount on the far side relative to her position. A partial shot, difficult geometry. She could see one of the men working to reorient the weapon, and she knew that once that gun was pointing at them, the math changed catastrophically. She took a breath. She fired. The man at the gun fell sideways off the truck bed. The gun went silent. For 3 full seconds, nobody said anything. The only sounds were the wind and the distant crack of small arms from the ridge and the settling creak of the helicopter wreckage. Then Beckett said, "Did she just?" "Yes," Garrett said. "She did." A pause. "Grant, outstanding." She didn't answer. She was scanning the ridge again because the ridgeline never stopped being a problem, and outstanding was a word she could think about later, when Sullivan was stable and the support helicopters were overhead, and the man in the valley had stopped smiling. Later. There was going to be a later. She was going to make sure of it. 22 minutes remaining. The regrouped fighters on the ridge made their next move exactly when Sullivan had predicted. They changed their axis of approach, shifting from a direct frontal position to a diagonal movement that tried to split the team's attention. Half the pressure coming from the ridge, half coming from a dry creek bed to the northeast that provided concealed movement right to within 100 meters of their position. She saw it developing before Garrett called it. "Northeast. They're using the creek." "I see movement," she confirmed. 5, maybe 6 individuals, 60 meters in closing. Torres, "I can't cover both the ridge and the creek." "I've got the ridge," she said. "Torres, take the creek." A fraction of a second passed. She heard Torres shift position. She heard Garrett acknowledge. She kept her scope on the ridge and moved systematically. Find, fire, find, fire, keeping the pressure on the elevated shooters while Torres dealt with the closer threat. It was a different kind of attention. She was maintaining 2 tracks simultaneously. The mechanics of the rifle, the inventory in her mind, the sounds behind her that told her where everyone was and what they needed. Beckett called for ammunition at the 20-minute mark, and she reached back without taking her eye off the scope and pushed a loaded magazine toward his voice. She heard him pick it up and load. "Good call on the ammo weight," he said. Just that. Sullivan was getting weaker. She could hear it in his breathing. Shallower, more effortful. The sound of a body working too hard to maintain its own basics. She reached back during a brief lull and checked the dressing. The hemostatic packing was holding. He hadn't lost consciousness. "Stay with me," she said. "Nowhere else to be," he said, and his voice had the dry quality of a man who was using humor to push back against something that frightened him. "Talk to me," she said. "Keep talking." "About what?" "Anything. Tell me about the rifle." A brief pause, then slowly, K2 configuration. Floating barrel, adjustable stock. Glass is a Schmidt and Bender. Best optic in the inventory. You're shooting it at about 70% of its actual capability right now. What does the other 30% take? Years, he said, and a lot of patience. I'll settle for tonight. You're doing better than settling. She found a target on the ridge, fired, found another. The incoming fire from that direction was thin now. She had degraded their effectiveness enough that the ridge was no longer the primary threat. The creek bed to the northeast was the pressure point. She could hear Torres working it, the sharp bark of his rifle in disciplined bursts. Then, a sound she hadn't heard before. A deeper crack, followed by something that moved through the air with a different quality, slower, heavier, an AK at close range, very close range. Torres is hit, Beckett shouting. She spun. Torres was down behind his position, not crumpled the way Sullivan had gone down, but low and cursing, his hand pressed to his upper left arm. He was still functional, still moving, but his shooting arm was compromised, and the creek bed was 30 meters away. How bad? Garrett demanded. Through and through on the arm, Torres said through clenched teeth. I can still work. Can you cover south? Give me a second. He shifted, repositioned, got his weapon into a modified one-handed grip that most people couldn't have managed. I've got it. But the creek was exposed. She made the decision before she fully articulated it. She pulled back from the berm with Sullivan's rifle and moved 20 feet to the right, taking a new angle on the creek bed. It was closer work now, faster, no time for the long breath and the patient hold. Shoot and move, suppress and relocate. She put 3 rounds into the creek bed in 7 seconds. The movement there stopped. Garrett looked at her from across the wreckage. In the middle of everything, the noise, the smoke, the weight of everything that was happening, he held her gaze for exactly 1 second, and what she saw in his face was something she had never expected to see there. It was not simply approval. It was not even respect, though it contained both of those things. It was the look of a person who has just discovered that something they thought was solid ground is actually bedrock, something that goes all the way down. He looked away, back to the radio, back to the job. 15 minutes. The next twist came from a direction none of them expected. A voice, speaking English, coming from the northeast, from the creek bed, not shouted but projected with deliberate volume. American, we have your man. Come out or we shoot. Silence fell over the position like a weight dropping. Beckett's voice, barely above a whisper. They got somebody. Nobody's unaccounted for, Torres said immediately. They're bluffing, Garrett said, but his hand went to his radio, and she could see him running through the count in his head. 4 operators, 1 logistics specialist, 1 wounded, and arriving at the same math Torres had. They are bluffing, she said quietly, but they want us to move to find out. Garrett looked at her. If we break cover to investigate, we expose ourselves, she said. That's the play. They couldn't get to us by fire, so they're trying to get us by confusion. A beat, Torres. She's right. Garrett keyed the radio and spoke. Not to the voice in the creek, to the support element. Say again your ETA. Say again. He listened. His jaw tightened. Copy. Expedite if possible. He looked at her. 12 minutes. We stay put, she said. We stay put, he confirmed. The voice in the creek called again. Longer this time. More detail. The detail was specific enough to be unnerving. A name, a unit designation, information that felt real. She felt the doubt flicker through the group like a cold current. She felt it in herself. Don't move, she said, not to anyone specifically, to all of them, to herself. They want us moving, we don't move. Sullivan reached out from behind her and touched her ankle. She looked back. His face was pale and his eyes were not entirely clear, but his voice was steady. You're right, he said. Classic pressure tactic. Force a decision under stress. We hold. Garrett nodded once, sharply. We hold. The voice in the creek went silent. 8 minutes later, she heard them. Long before she could see anything, she heard the distinctive thud, thud, thud of rotary blades, and it was a different sound from the helicopter that had gone down. Deeper, more powerful, the sound of a machine built specifically for what was about to happen. Apaches, 2 of them, coming in from the south. She felt the change move through the team like electricity through a circuit. Not celebration, not yet, but the particular shift of people who have been holding against impossible odds and can finally feel the scale begin to tip. Garrett was on the radio, talking the aircraft onto the targets with the calm precision of a man who had done this before and trusted the process completely. She heard him call out the creek bed, the ridge, the stalled truck in the valley. The Apaches went to work. She kept her position on the berm. She kept the scope up. She didn't stop doing the job until Garrett's hand came down on her shoulder, and his voice, finally, without the tightly coiled urgency of the last 40 minutes, said, "Stand down, Grant. We're clear." She lowered the rifle. She turned and looked at Sullivan. He was watching her with eyes that were clearer than they had been 20 minutes ago. The adrenaline, maybe, or the proximity of rescue, or simply the stubborn refusal of a man like Sullivan to go anywhere without his own permission. His face was drawn and white, and his breathing was still too shallow, but he was there, fully there. "You held the position," he said. She looked down at the rifle in her hands. Then she set it down carefully, with both hands, the way he had handled it at the base. The weight of it left her palms, and her arms felt strange without it, lighter than they should have been. "You talked me through it," she said. "No," he said. "I told you one thing on the helicopter. You did the rest." He paused. "That shot on the truck, the moving shot, where did you learn that?" She almost laughed. "I didn't," she said. "I just did the math." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what it is." Beckett appeared at her side, and he was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you understood and suddenly don't. He didn't say anything with words. He just nodded at her, a single, slow nod that carried everything he didn't know how to say. Torres was applying a field dressing to his own arm with a competence that was almost insulting given the circumstances. He caught her looking and said, "Good call. Staying put. Could have gone wrong if anyone moved." "It still could have gone wrong regardless," she said. "Yeah," he said, "but it didn't." The Apaches were visible now, moving in wide arcs over the valley, and the sound of enemy fire had stopped. Not tapering, stopped. The way things stop when the deciding variable has been removed from the equation. She sat down for the first time in 43 minutes. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The shaking came now, the way it always comes. After, not during, because the body knows better than to fall apart when falling apart will get you killed. She let it come. She put her hands on her knees and breathed and looked at the sky, which was pale and enormous and entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened. Garrett sat down next to her. Not to speak initially, just to be present in the way that experienced leaders understand is sometimes more valuable than words. After a moment, she said, "Sullivan needs evac, now." "Birds inbound," he said. 4 minutes. "His pressure's been dropping for the last 10 minutes. He needs a surgeon." "I know." He looked at her sideways. "You kept checking on him." "He was behind me. It was easy to monitor." "You were in the middle of a firefight." "He needed monitoring." Garrett said nothing for several seconds, then, "How many rounds did you fire?" She knew the number exactly. She always knew the numbers exactly. 17, she said. He was quiet again. She didn't elaborate. She didn't feel the need to explain what 17 rounds in that context meant, or what it had cost to fire them, or what she was going to have to do with the knowledge of those 17 rounds for the rest of her life. She would figure that out. Later, the medevac helicopter came in fast and low. and the crew was out and moving to Sullivan before the skids fully settled. And she guided them to him with the same calm efficiency she brought to every logistics problem, directing, informing, transferring the information about his wound and his timeline to people whose job it now was to carry it forward. Sullivan looked at her once as they loaded him. "I want my rifle back when I'm out of surgery," he said. "I'll keep it safe," she said. He closed his eyes. The helicopter lifted. She stood and watched it go. Garrett stood beside her. And then, because he was a man who believed in saying the true thing at the right moment rather than the comfortable thing at any moment, he said it. "You saved this team today," he said. "I need you to understand that, not as a compliment, as a fact." She didn't answer. "And I need you to think about something," he continued. "When we get back to Griffin, because what I watched you do out here today was not a one-time thing. What you did out here today was a talent, and talent like that shouldn't stay behind a supply counter." She turned and looked at him. His pale gray eyes were steady and direct and entirely serious. "What are you saying, Lieutenant?" "I'm saying I want to have a conversation," he said. "When Sullivan's in a bed and Torres has stitches, and we've had about 6 hours of sleep." She looked at the horizon where the medevac had disappeared. She looked at the rifle she was still holding. She didn't say anything, but something inside her that had been pressing against a door for 24 years pressed a little harder. The valley was quiet now. The dust was settling. Somewhere to the north, the commander who had pressed his boot onto a soldier's chest and laughed was no longer laughing. She walked back toward the wreckage and began, methodically and precisely, to account for every round that had been fired. Orchestrated narrative continuation with dramatic pacing and character development. The accounting took her 11 minutes. Every brass casing she could recover, every round expended versus rounds remaining, every notation in the field log that she had somehow kept current, even through the firefight. Because that was who she was, and a helicopter going down in 40 minutes of combat and 17 rounds fired from a dead man's rifle had not changed that. If anything, it had sharpened it. The numbers were the anchor. The numbers were the thing that kept her connected to the part of herself that hadn't changed today. She didn't know yet how much had changed. She would figure that out later. Beckett watched her work through the accounting without saying anything for a long time. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that he hadn't mentioned to anyone, and the dried blood made him look more serious than he probably intended. Finally, he said, "You know you don't have to do that right now." "Yes, I do," she said. He thought about arguing. She could see him considering it. Then he simply sat down on a piece of wreckage and waited for her to finish, which was its own kind of respect. Torres had his arm in a field sling and was on the radio coordinating their extraction with a patience and specificity that impressed her. The man had a bullet hole through his bicep and was managing logistics with a precision that she recognized, because it was the same impulse she was acting on right now. Professionals did not stop being professionals because circumstances got hard. They became more professional. It was the only reliable defense against chaos. Garrett had moved to the perimeter, walking it slowly, assessing, the habit of a leader who could not entirely stand down even when the immediate threat was gone. She watched him from her position on the ground and thought about what he had said. Talent like that shouldn't stay behind a supply counter. She had heard variations of that sentence before, usually from people who meant well and understood very little about how the system actually worked. But Garrett was not that kind of person. She had known him for less than 24 hours, and she already understood that he did not say things he didn't mean, and he did not mean things he wasn't prepared to act on. The conversation he'd promised was real. Whatever it led to was real. She closed the field log and stood up and her legs held, which was good because she had a feeling that the next several hours were going to require all of her. The extraction helicopter came in at 07:53, which meant they had been on the ground in that valley for exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes. It felt like 3 days and like 12 minutes simultaneously, which she had been told was a normal feature of combat, and which she was now able to confirm from personal experience. She was the last one onto the helicopter. Old habit, supply last, personnel first. She stepped aboard, found her seat, pulled the harness across her chest, and looked out at the valley as the aircraft lifted. The wreckage of the first helicopter was still down there. It would be recovered or destroyed later. The military had protocols for everything, including its own equipment lying broken in the dust. She looked at it and thought about the 40 minutes between the crash and the Apaches arriving. And she thought about everything that had happened inside those 40 minutes. And she felt something she could not immediately name. It wasn't pride. It was too heavy for pride. It wasn't grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was the specific weight of a person who has crossed a line they knew existed and can now see it clearly for the first time because they are standing on the other side of it. She had killed people today. That was the simple fact of it, and she was not going to dress it up or avoid it or tuck it behind language that made it something other than what it was. She had done it to keep her team alive, and she would do it again under the same circumstances. And those two facts lived in her at the same time without canceling each other out. Sullivan had said, "When the training runs out, you think." She thought now that there was a third thing, after training and thinking. Something that didn't have a clean name. The thing that had kept her hands steady on a rifle she had no business firing at targets she couldn't have been expected to hit. The thing that had let her say, "Your call," when Garrett said it, and actually believe it. She didn't know what to call it. She suspected she would spend a long time figuring that out. Garrett sat across from her in the helicopter, and his eyes were closed, and she knew he wasn't sleeping. She watched him for a moment and thought, he did this to himself voluntarily, not once, many times. Whatever conversation he had promised her, it would be coming from a man who had made the calculation she was making right now, and had made it repeatedly, and had found something worth holding on to on the other side of it. She wanted to ask him about that. Later. They landed at Griffin at 09:20, and the base looked exactly the same as it always had, which struck her as almost offensive. She had expected something to be different. The angles of the buildings, the quality of the light, the way the dust sat on every surface. It should have shifted somehow, registered the weight of what had happened in that valley. It hadn't. It was exactly the same base, same gravel, same heat, same row of supply pallets that she had been standing next to 17 hours ago when a man with pale gray eyes had asked her if she was the supply specialist. She was still the supply specialist. She was also something else now. Both of those things were true. The debrief happened at 10:00 hours in a room with a table and 4 chairs and a recording device and a colonel named Whitfield who had the particular energy of a senior officer managing several competing pressures simultaneously. She could see it in the way he arranged his papers, in the way he looked at Garrett when they walked in. Not with hostility exactly, but with the wariness of a man who knows that the report he's about to receive is going to create administrative complications. She sat across the table and answered questions for 90 minutes. Whitfield was thorough. He went through the mission timeline from the moment they boarded the helicopter at Griffin, and he was precise and technical and gave nothing away in his expression. She gave precise and technical answers, and she did not minimize or elaborate beyond what the record required. When they reached the section about Sullivan going down, Whitfield paused and looked at her across the table. "Specialist Grant," he said, "you took over as the primary sniper for the element." "Yes, sir," without a formal designation. "There was no one else available, sir. SEAL Sullivan was incapacitated. Lieutenant Garrett and Chief Torres were managing the perimeter, and Petty Officer Beckett was holding the right flank." "And you had prior training on the M110. She thought about the honest answer. "I had familiarization, sir. SEAL Sullivan walked me through the fundamentals informally at Griffin prior to departure. I had qualified expert on the M4 and had a foundational understanding of precision rifle mechanics." Whitfield wrote something. He wrote for longer than the answer seemed to warrant. 17 rounds expended, he said. 11 confirmed kills or incapacitations. 1 disabled technical vehicle. How do you account for that level of effectiveness, given your stated level of experience? She thought about it. She thought about Sullivan's answer. You think. She thought about the way the rifle had felt in her hands. Not foreign, not wrong. Heavy with purpose. Situational clarity, sir, she said. When the stakes are absolute, you don't have room for hesitation. And I understand ballistics. The math of it isn't different from the math I do every day. It's just applied differently. Whitfield looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Situational clarity, he repeated. Yes, sir. He wrote something else. Closed the folder. Looked at Garrett. Lieutenant, he said, you'll have my full report within 48 hours. In the meantime, I'd suggest your element get medical clearance and some rest. He paused. All of your element, including Specialist Grant. It was the word all that she noticed, including, as if it hadn't been certain that she would be counted among the element's members until this moment. She didn't say anything. She sat straight and waited for dismissal, and walked out of the room with Garrett on her left, in the sense of a door opening somewhere ahead of her that she couldn't yet see clearly. It was in the corridor outside the debrief room at 11:23 in the morning that she heard about Sullivan. Beckett came around the corner from the direction of the medical facility with his cut eyebrow freshly stitched and an expression on his face that stopped her cold. How is he? She asked immediately. Beckett's face shifted. He's out of surgery. Surgeon said another 20 minutes and he'd have bled out internally. The hemostatic packing slowed it enough. He paused. Doc said whoever applied that dressing knew what they were doing. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she had been holding tight since the moment Sullivan had gone down. He's going to be okay? She asked. 3 months recovery, maybe 4. He's going to be pissed about that. Something softened in Beckett's expression. But yeah, he's going to be okay. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. She turned away from both of them, ostensibly to look at nothing in particular, and she breathed for several seconds. Behind her, she heard Beckett say quietly to Garrett, "She saved him twice." Garrett said nothing. She turned back around. "I want to see him," she said. "They're saying no visitors until... I want to see him." Beckett looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at her. "1 minute," he said. Sullivan was awake, which surprised her. He was pale in a way that made the pillow behind him look almost gray by comparison, and there were lines running to his arm and a monitor beside the bed, and he had the particular focused alertness of a person who has been informed by their own body of exactly how close things came. When she walked in, he looked at her and said, "You came back. You told me to keep your rifle safe," she said. "You still have it?" "Armory logged it in an hour ago." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped. "Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over." She sat in the chair beside the bed. For the first time since the helicopter had been hit, she felt the full weight of the last 12 hours settle onto her in a single, concentrated mass. Her shoulders dropped. She became aware of how much she ached. Hands, neck, back, the place where the harness had cut into her collarbone on impact. 11, Sullivan said. She looked at him. "What?" 11 confirmed. I heard Beckett telling someone in the corridor. His pale eyes were steady on her. "You fired 17 rounds and got 11. That's a 65% effectiveness rate in dynamic combat with an unfamiliar system. First time in a live engagement." He paused. "That's not beginner's luck, Grant. What is it then?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It's aptitude," he said. "The kind you either have or you don't. The kind you can train into something extraordinary if you start early enough." He shifted in the bed, and she could see the cost of the movement in his face, but he didn't stop. "Garrett talked to you." He mentioned a conversation. He's been looking for a reason to recommend someone to the sniper pipeline for 2 years. Sullivan said. Nobody's fit the profile the way he needs. He doesn't recommend people as a favor. He recommends them when he believes they'll be exceptional. She didn't say anything. He believes you'll be exceptional, Sullivan said. So do I. The monitor beeped. Outside the room, she could hear the bass going about its day. Vehicles moving, voices carrying across the gravel, the machinery of a military installation that never fully stopped. She thought about the supply depot, the pallets, the clipboard, the spreadsheet columns that she had spent 2 years filling with a precision that nobody particularly noticed. I'm a logistics specialist, she said. You were, Sullivan said. She sat with that for a moment. Rest, she said finally, standing. You're not as intimidating as you think you are when you're hooked up to an IV. Come back tomorrow, he said. I want to hear what you decide. She didn't promise anything, but she stopped at the door and turned back and said, The moving shot, the truck, I missed the driver. I know, Beckett told me. I recalculated too slow. I had the lead wrong by about 8 inches. Sullivan nodded, not dismissively, seriously. What would you do differently? She had been thinking about it since the moment she fired. I was calculating from the truck's current speed. I should have accounted for deceleration over rough terrain. The road surface was degrading the speed incrementally. I was aiming for where it was. I should have aimed for where it was going to be when it was slower. Sullivan stared at her. What? She said. Most trained snipers take 6 months to understand that concept, he said. She walked out. The conversation with Garrett happened at 1400 in a small room near the operations center that had 2 chairs and no table and felt less like an office than like a place where the truth could be said without being recorded. He was already there when she arrived, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose. And he looked at her when she came in the way you look at someone when you've already had the conversation in your head and you're ready for the real version. Sit down, he said. She sat. How are you? He asked. Not perfunctorily, actually asking. Processing, she said. That's honest. He looked at his hands. It doesn't get completely easier. I want to be straight with you about that. The first time doesn't stop being the first time. But you develop a relationship with it that becomes workable. That's the best word I have. Workable, she said. Better than the alternative, he said, which is either not thinking about it at all, which turns you into something you don't want to be, or thinking about it so much that it becomes the only thing, which takes you out of the fight. She nodded. She understood the geometry of that. I want to talk to you about sniper school, he said. She had known it was coming. She had known since he said it in the valley, but hearing the words said flat and direct in this quiet room still hit her with a force she hadn't fully anticipated. A physical sensation in the sternum, somewhere between impact and opening. I'm a logistics specialist, she said again, but this time it came out differently. It came out the way you say a thing when you're testing whether it's still true. You're a person with an extraordinary rare ability who happens to currently work in logistics, he said. Those are not the same thing. The Army sees them as the same thing. The Army sees what it's told to see, he said. My recommendation carries weight, more than you might think, given the nature of what happened this morning. He paused. Whitfield is going to write a report. That report is going to describe what you did in terms that will open a door that is normally closed to personnel in your position. What happens after that door opens depends entirely on what you decide to do. She looked at him. What exactly are you recommending? Special applications sniper pipeline, he said. Expedited track based on combat demonstrated aptitude. It's not common. It exists. The record from this morning justifies it. He held her gaze. 17 rounds, 11 effective, moving vehicle engagement, 400+ meter shots under direct fire, field-applied medical intervention on a critical casualty, command decisions under stress that were correct. He stopped. That's not a logistics specialist having a good day. That's an operator who doesn't know yet that she's an operator. The word hung in the air between them. Operator. She thought about the pallets, the spreadsheets, the morning she had stood in the supply depot at 0600 and felt the pull of something she couldn't name. She thought about the rope that seemed to connect who she was and who she could be. And she thought about how long she had been standing at one end of it without pulling. If I say yes, she said, you start the formal evaluation process within 30 days, he said. It won't be easy. I want to be direct about that too. The pipeline is designed to filter out everyone who shouldn't be there, and it does that efficiently and without apology. You'll be tested in ways that will make this morning look manageable. And if I make it through, then you become one of about 300 people in the entire military who can do what you did today, but with full training behind it. He leaned back. You'd be one of very few women to hold that designation. Is that supposed to make it more appealing or more daunting? She asked. The corner of his mouth moved, not a full smile, the precursor to one. Both, he said, depending on who's asking. She sat with it. She let it be real in the room for a moment, instead of just a concept. I need to think, she said. You have time, he said. Not unlimited time, but time. How much? 48 hours, he said. Whitfield's report goes up in 48 hours. If your name is going to be in it the way it needs to be, I need to know before then. She stood. Her legs were steadier than they had been an hour ago. Something was settling inside her. Not a decision yet, but the ground on which a decision could be made. One question, she said. Go ahead. Sullivan, she said. When he's recovered, does he come back to the element? Garrett looked at her steadily. Why does that matter to your decision? Because he was going to teach me, she said, on the rifle. After the familiarization, he was going to take time and do it properly. I could tell. She paused. I want to learn from someone who does it right. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a specific quality that is rare enough to be worth noting when you see it. The quality of a person who understands instinctively that excellence is not achieved alone. Sullivan will be back in 6 months, he said. If you're in the pipeline by then, there are ways to structure the overlap. She nodded. She walked to the door and stopped, turned back. Lieutenant, she said. Grant. Thank you for asking me to volunteer. She said it clean and direct, without decoration. I've been waiting for someone to ask for a long time. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. I could tell. She walked out into the heat of the base, and it was the same heat it had always been. And the gravel was the same gravel, and the supply depot was exactly where it had always been, with its pallets and its crates and its neat rows of accountable ordnance. She walked past it. She walked to the edge of the base's perimeter road, where you could see the mountains to the north if you looked, pale and distant and enormous and completely indifferent. She stood there and looked at them for a long time. Ruiz found her there at 1600. He had heard the way everyone on a forward operating base hears everything within 6 hours of it happening, and he stood beside her without speaking first, which she respected. I heard about Sullivan, he said finally. He's going to be fine. And Torres, through and through, he'll have a scar. And you, she kept looking at the mountains. I'm fine, Denny. You don't look fine. I'm not falling apart, she said. That's different from fine. Fine is later. Right now I'm functional in processing and making a decision. He was quiet. The sniper thing, he said. She looked at him. He made a small, resigned gesture with his hands. The gesture of a man who has accepted a conclusion he doesn't love, but can't argue with. Yeah, she said. It's going to be hard, he said. I know. You're going to be away for a long time. I know that too. He nodded slowly. He looked at the mountains the way a person looks at something they're resigning themselves to. You're going to do it, he said, not a question. She thought about the rifle in her hands, the weight of it, the way the world had narrowed to a circle of glass and a decision that had to be made, and the way she had made it without flinching. She thought about Sullivan's words. When the training runs out, you think. She thought about Garrett's words. You're an operator who doesn't know yet that she's an operator. She thought about the moment before she fired the first shot, when everything had been uncertain, and she had done it anyway, because the alternative was watching her team die. Yeah, she said, I'm going to do it. Ruiz exhaled, long and slow. Then he put his hand on her shoulder for exactly 2 seconds. The brief, wordless acknowledgement of a person who has run out of cautions to give and found at the end of them something close to pride. Be careful, he said. I'll be precise, she said. That's better. He walked away. She stood there a while longer, looking north. The mountains held their ground. They always did. That was the thing about them. They didn't move for anyone. She was beginning to understand that feeling. 48 hours. That was what Garrett had given her, and she had used every one of them. She had not slept the first night, not from anxiety, or at least not entirely from anxiety, but from the particular wakefulness of a person whose mind is running through a calculation too important to pause. She had lain on her bunk in the supply barracks and stared at the ceiling and thought about every version of the decision. And by 0300, she had reached the same answer from every direction. And by 0400, she had stopped thinking and started feeling it. And by 0500, she had accepted it the way you accept something that was always going to be true. She had gone to Garrett at 0700 the next morning, before the base fully woke, and she had stood in his doorway and said, yes. He had looked up from whatever he was reading and nodded once, with the gravity of a man receiving news he had prepared for and still found weighty. I'll have the recommendations submitted by end of day, he said. The evaluation packet will reach you within 10 days. Read everything. The physical standards are not negotiable, and neither is the psychological screening. I understand, she said. One more thing, he said. He set down what he was reading and looked at her directly. Whatever happens in the pipeline, and some of it is going to be hard in ways you can't predict right now, remember what you did in that valley. Not as a comfort, as evidence. You've already proven the core of it. The training is just the architecture around something that already exists. She had walked back to the supply depot after that and finished her morning inventory, because the ammunition still needed counting and the reports still needed filing, and she was still, for now, Specialist Grant, the logistics specialist, and she would be that person until the day she wasn't. And she intended to be that person with full precision until the last possible moment. That was 11 days ago. The evaluation packet had arrived on day 9, delivered by a courier with no return unit designation and a signature requirement that felt like the first small test. She had signed without hesitation and carried the envelope to her bunk and read every page twice before she closed it. The physical standards were not negotiable. That was accurate. She had folded the fitness requirements into a training schedule that she implemented the next morning at 0500, adding runs and load carries and grip work to days that were already full. Her body protested in the way bodies protest when asked to expand their limits rapidly and without courtesy. She ignored it the way she had learned to ignore things that were temporary obstacles rather than actual barriers. The psychological screening happened on day 11, in a room at the medical facility with a major named Chen, who had very steady eyes and a voice that gave nothing away, and questions that were not the questions she expected. Chen had not asked her how she felt about killing. She had expected that question. Instead, Chen had asked her why she thought she had stayed calm in the helicopter when the RPG hit. She had thought about it honestly. I don't know that calm is the right word, she said. I think my brain made a decision about what was useful and what wasn't. Fear was not going to help me survive the impact, so it went somewhere else. The inventory was. So I thought about the inventory. Chen had written something. You defaulted to your function under extreme stress, she said. Yes. And the shooting? Same process, she said. The rifles needed someone behind them. I was the available person. I did the math. You make it sound very simple. It wasn't simple, she said, but it was clear. There's a difference. Chen had looked at her for a long moment with those steady eyes, and then she had written something else, and Aninssley had understood from the quality of the silence that the answer had been correct. Not in the sense of a right answer on a test, but in the sense of a true answer that matched the profile of what was being built. She walked out of that room feeling, for the first time since the valley, that the path ahead had actual shape. That was today, 1,400 hours, day 11. She was sitting on a bench outside the medical facility, reading through the second section of the evaluation packet for the third time, when Beckett sat down next to her. He did it without announcing himself, the way operators tended to do everything, economically, without wasted motion, arriving at the destination and skipping the performance of arrival. She had noticed this about all of them, the way they occupied space differently from other soldiers, more deliberately, like every physical choice was a small decision rather than an accident. She was starting to understand why. Chen let you out early, he said. I answered the questions, she said without looking up from the packet. She kept Torres for 3.5 hours after the thing in Kandahar 2 years ago. What happened in Kandahar 2 years ago? He was quiet for a moment. Different kind of hard day, he said. The kind where the decisions were right and still cost something. She looked up from the packet. He was looking at the middle distance, and his expression had the quality of old weight carried competently. Not gone, but managed. She recognized it. She was beginning to acquire her own version of it. How did he come through it? She asked. Torres? Beckett thought about the question seriously. He stopped making it about whether the decision was correct and started making it about whether the decision was necessary. When a thing is necessary, you can carry it. When you're still debating whether it was correct, it sits differently. She thought about that. Thought about 17 rounds, 11 effective, a truck with a blown tire in a valley in Panjwai district. Necessary, she said quietly. Every single one, he said, without ambiguity, without softening. He said it the way you state a fact that has been examined from every angle and found to hold. She went back to the packet. After a moment, Beckett said, Sullivan's asking for you. She looked up. He was supposed to be resting. He's Sullivan. He doesn't rest. He just rests more aggressively than he does everything else. He stood. Medical facility, room 4. He's apparently been waiting since this morning, and he's been making the nursing staff miserable about it. She tucked the packet under her arm and went. Sullivan was sitting up in bed with his laptop open, and 3 printed documents spread across his blanket, and an expression on his face that was the precise opposite of a man who had been near death 11 days ago. He looked, if anything, sharper than she had seen him before, leaner, more focused, the way a blade looks after it's been through something that tested it and came out with a better edge. Close the door, he said when she walked in. She closed it. Sit down. You look better, she said. I feel terrible, he said, but his voice didn't match the words. He moved one of the printed documents off the bed to make space that she didn't need and gestured at the chair. Garrett told me you submitted your answer. You're going into the pipeline. Evaluation phase first, she said. You'll pass the evaluation, he said, with a certainty that was not boastful on his behalf, because it wasn't about him. It was simply a statement about her, made by someone who had watched her work and reached a conclusion. That's not what I wanted to talk about. She waited. He turned the laptop around to face her. On the screen was a ballistics chart, the kind she had seen in technical manuals, dense with variables and compensations and range data. I've been building something for you, he said, since I've had nothing to do but lie here and be annoyed at my own blood vessels. He paused. A primer. The things I wish someone had told me before I started the pipeline instead of during it. She looked at the screen. The document was detailed. More detailed than she had expected. Not a summary, but a comprehensive breakdown, handwritten in the specific way of someone who teaches by building the whole architecture before explaining any single brick. "Sullivan," she said. "Don't make it into something," he said. "You kept me alive, and you picked up my rifle and did something with it that I've been doing for 8 years. I don't know how to feel about that yet, but I know what I owe you." She looked at the screen for a long moment. "How long did this take?" "Most of the last 4 days. I wasn't sleeping much anyway." She took the laptop and read for 2 minutes in silence. He let her. The document was not just technical. It was personal, written in the voice of a man who had failed at specific things and learned from them, and was now transferring that learning with a directness that left no room for false modesty or unnecessary encouragement. It told her what she was going to struggle with. It told her what would be tested hardest. It told her where the evaluation process designed its worst traps and where the instructors would be watching for the specific kind of brittleness that looked like competence until pressure exposed the difference. "This is real," she said. "Everything in it is from personal experience," he said. "None of it is in any manual." She looked up at him. "Why didn't you ever put this together before? For other candidates?" He met her eyes and said something honest. "Because I've never watched someone do what you did and thought they actually belonged here before," he said. "Most candidates come in trained. You came in ready. That's different. Trained is something you build. Ready is something you either are or you aren't. And training either confirms it or exposes the absence of it." He paused. "I needed to give you what you'd need to survive the confirmation process." The monitor beside his bed beeped. Outside the room, someone in the corridor was having a conversation that rose and fell like weather. She closed the laptop and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of what was inside it. Not the physical weight, but the other kind. The weight of one person handing another person the specific tools that might determine what they become. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate and she knew it. And she said it anyway, because sometimes adequacy isn't the point. He waved a hand. "Come back in 2 days. I want to go through the first 3 sections with you verbally. There are things in there that read differently when someone explains them. You're supposed to be recovering." "I'm recovering and teaching," he said. "I can do both. I'm very talented." She was almost at the door when he said, "Grant." She stopped. "What happened on that berm?" he said. "After I went down, you made a decision in about 3 seconds that most people in your position would have taken 3 minutes to make. And those 3 minutes would have cost lives." He stopped. "I need you to understand that the 3-second version is not luck, and it's not adrenaline. It's how you're wired. Don't let anyone in the pipeline tell you that you need to slow down. Your instincts are running ahead of your training, and training is going to catch up with them. Not the other way around. Don't let anyone flip that." She stood at the door for a moment. "How will I know if someone's trying to flip it?" she asked. "They'll tell you to doubt yourself," he said. "The good instructors will teach you to test yourself. There's a difference. Feel for the difference." She walked out. The next 6 days at Griffin moved with a quality she had not experienced before, a kind of compressed, purposeful urgency that was different from the workmanlike steadiness of logistics. She trained every morning before the base woke up. She read Sullivan's document in sections. She met with him twice, and the sessions were unlike any instruction she had received before. He talked and she asked questions, and he answered them without condescension. And then he pushed back on her questions, demanding that she think not just about what, but about why. And then he pushed further, and she pushed back. And twice he said something that surprised her enough that she stopped mid-sentence. And once she said something that made him go quiet for a full 30 seconds before responding. On day 17, Whitfield's report reached the proper desks. She knew because Garrett came to find her at 1600 with an expression that was as close to pleased as she had seen on him, which was not very close but was unmistakably present. The recommendation was accepted, he said. She felt it move through her like current. Accepted, meaning you're formally in the evaluation pipeline. You report to Fort Bragg in 9 days for the first phase of assessment. He paused. I told you the report would open the door. You did, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those pale gray eyes that she had come to read with some fluency over the past days. Something was behind them that she hadn't seen before. Not pride exactly. Something older and more serious than pride. The particular feeling of a person who has done something that can't be undone and is at peace with that. There's something else, he said. She waited. The intelligence product from the Panjwai mission came back, he said. Roshan, the target, was taken off the board by a follow-on element 48 hours after our insertion. The intelligence we developed on the ground contributed to that. He paused. What happened in that valley had a second-order effect that extended beyond the day itself. She processed that. She thought about the compound in Panjwai. She thought about the IED components that Roshan had been moving through 3 provinces. She thought about roads and vehicles and the people who traveled them. Good, she said, simply, without ceremony. Yes, Garrett said. Good. He left, and she stood in the fading light of the late afternoon and let herself feel the full weight of the 9 days ahead. The uncertainty of what came after them, the length and difficulty of the pipeline, and the thing at the end of it that she could not yet fully see, but that had been real and true and inevitable since the moment she had picked up Sullivan's rifle and found, in the holding of it, something that fit. She was finishing her evening run at 18:30 when Torres fell into stride beside her. Not metaphorically, literally appeared at her left shoulder from somewhere she hadn't been watching and matched her pace without invitation, which should have been annoying and wasn't. His arm was out of the sling now, moving with a slight stiffness that she noticed because she noticed everything. And his expression was its usual, unreadable, professional baseline. They ran in silence for 3 minutes. She didn't ask what he wanted. She had learned that Torres operated on his own timeline, and that interrupting it was inefficient. Finally, he said, Beckett told me you're leaving in 9 days. Fort Bragg, she said. First phase. He nodded, not breaking stride. I went through the pipeline 7 years ago, he said. Different track, same pressure. She looked at him sideways. Did you have advice? Don't get in your own way, he said. The pipeline isn't designed to teach you things you don't have. It's designed to find out what you do have and whether it holds under systematic pressure. If it holds, you pass. If it doesn't hold, you find out early instead of late. Both outcomes are useful. And if I start to doubt whether it holds, you already know the answer, he said. You figured that out on the berm. They ran in silence for another minute. Torres, she said. Grant. In the debrief, when Whitfield asked how I accounted for the effectiveness given my level of experience, she paused. He said situational clarity. I said it, but I want to know what you think the actual answer is. He ran for a moment without responding. She waited. I think you have a quality that is very rare and not well understood by most of the people who try to train for it, he said finally. The quality of being fully present inside a crisis without the crisis changing who you are. Most people, under enough pressure, become someone slightly different. The fear takes partial control and the real person steps back a few degrees. You didn't do that. He paused. On the berm, you were exactly who you are in the supply depot when you're counting rounds. The same brain, the same precision, the same decisiveness, just with higher stakes. She thought about that. Is that trainable? No, he said, but it's protectable. The pipeline will try to take it from you by stacking enough stress that your brain starts looking for shortcuts. Your job is to not let it. Every time you feel yourself starting to become someone different under pressure, come back to the counting. Come back to the exact version of the problem in front of you. Don't abstract it. Don't generalize it. Stay with the specific thing. She filed it. She filed it exactly the way she filed inventory data, permanently, in the place where things that matter are stored. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Pass." He peeled off to the right and was gone, and she finished the last 800 meters of her run alone and came back to the supply depot and began for the last time this tour the evening inventory. She went through every item, methodically, completely, with the same precision she had brought to the task every day for 2 years. At the end, the numbers were exactly right. They always were. She closed the log and set down the tablet and looked at the rows of crates in the amber light. This room was the beginning of everything that had happened. The chance encounter, the clipboard, the question of whether she was the supply specialist. Everything that followed had started here, in this room, with a woman who knew where every round was stored and felt, underneath the competence, the quiet, constant pull of something more. She turned off the light and walked out. On day 18, 48 hours before her departure, Sullivan was cleared for limited mobility, and she found him in the courtyard at 0700, sitting with his laptop and a cup of coffee and an expression of deep, concentrated irritation at something on the screen. "The fourth section," he said without looking up. "There's a calculation error. I was on painkillers when I wrote it. The lead time formula for targets moving across the shooter's axis is wrong." She sat down across from him. She pulled out the printed version she had been working from. She had already found the error. She had found it 3 days ago and had written the corrected formula in the margin with a note that said, "Checked against JACNA methodology, cross-referenced with field data from GWOT documentation. Correction confirmed." She slid the page across to him. He looked at it, at the margin note, at the corrected formula. He looked up at her. "You found it," he said. "Day 15, she said, "and you didn't tell me." "I wanted to see if you caught it yourself," she said. "I figured if you caught it, the primer was reliable, because even the errors got corrected. And if you didn't catch it, I'd have a data point about how much I should be cross-referencing independently." Sullivan stared at her for a long moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, but the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "Drink your coffee. We need to go through the convergence targeting section before you leave." She drank her coffee. On the last night before departure, she sat on the bench outside the medical facility at 2200 and called her mother. It was a 7-second delay satellite connection, and the audio cut in and out, and her mother's voice came through in fragments, but the important parts made it through. Her mother asked if she was safe. She said yes, and it was true enough. Her mother asked when she was coming home. She said she wasn't sure, which was completely true. Her mother said she had seen something on the news about Afghanistan, and she worried. Aninssley said the worrying was understood and appreciated, but not required. Then her mother said something that came through in a single, clear burst between the static. "Your father used to say that the people who make a difference are the ones who don't wait for permission." I never fully understood what he meant until right now. She sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Her father had died when she was 11. She carried the things he had said the way you carry the few remaining items of something that used to be more, carefully, in the most protected place you have. She had not waited for permission. She had waited for an opportunity, which was different. The opportunity had appeared in the form of a man with pale gray eyes and a folded piece of paper, and she had taken it. And 40 hours later, she had been lying prone behind a berm in Panjwai with a rifle she had no business firing, making shots that by every conventional measure she had no business making. The conventional measures were wrong. That was what she knew now. Not arrogantly, not carelessly, but as a simple and well-evidenced fact. The measure of what a person can do is not determined by their job title or their training record or the column they occupy in someone's organizational chart. It is determined by what happens when the moment arrives and the moment is real and there is no one else. She looked at the northern sky, clear tonight, Stars in numbers that the city-raised part of her still found startling after 2 years in the desert. She was 24 years old. She had counted rounds for 2 years and volunteered for a mission that wasn't hers, and survived a helicopter going down, and held a perimeter under fire, and kept a man alive, and picked up a rifle and made it count. And in 32 hours she would board a transport to Fort Bragg and begin the process of becoming something that she had always been, but had never had the language for. She wasn't afraid, not in the way she had expected to be afraid. There was something that might have been fear, yes, but it sat differently now, not as a warning, but as a compass. It was pointing forward toward the hard thing, toward the thing that was going to cost her and demand her and test everything Sullivan and Torres and Garrett had seen in her. And she was going to follow it there with the same precision she brought to every problem that mattered. She stood up from the bench. She walked back to the barracks. She packed her kit for the last time at Griffin, methodically, completely, every item in its place, every weight balanced, the way she did everything. When she was done, the pack was perfect. It always was. She laid down on the bunk and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 18 days, she slept without the numbers running through her head. There was nothing left to count here. Everything ahead of her was unmeasured territory, and she was going to walk into it with steady hands and clear eyes, and the bone-deep certainty of a person who has already proven, once, in the worst possible circumstances, exactly who she is. Fort Bragg was nothing like she expected, and exactly like Sullivan had warned her. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, when the Carolina air had just enough edge to it to feel like a reminder that comfort was a conditional thing. And the transport dropped her at a processing facility that smelled like floor wax and institutional coffee, and the particular anxiety of people who knew they were being evaluated before they had even set down their bags. There were 14 candidates in the first phase. She was the only woman. She noted this the way she noted inventory discrepancies, as a fact that required no emotional response but needed to be filed accurately. The lead instructor was a master sergeant named Volk, who was approximately the shape and temperament of a man who had decided at some point in his life that patience was a resource best allocated elsewhere. He walked down the line of candidates on day one and said nothing for a long time, and the silence was its own instruction. When he finally spoke, he said, "Most of you will not be here in 3 weeks. That is not a threat. It is a statistical fact based on 12 years of running this program. I mention it not to discourage you, but to clarify the situation so that no one is surprised later." He stopped in front of Aninssley. He looked at her file, then at her, then at the file again. "Grant," he said. "Yes, Sergeant." "You have a field engagement on your record," he said. "Panjwai, 11 effectives from 17 rounds with an unfamiliar system under direct fire." He closed the file. "You know what that tells me?" She waited. "Nothing," he said. "Yet. What a person does once in the field tells me what they did once. This program will tell me what they can do repeatedly, under controlled, systematic, escalating pressure, when the adrenaline is not there to carry them, and the only thing available is skill." He held her gaze for one additional second. "Let's find out." He moved on down the line. She breathed. The first week was physical in ways she had prepared for, and mental in ways she had not. The load carries were longer than the packet had described. Sullivan had warned her about this, had told her the documented standards were the floor, not the ceiling. And the sleep deprivation was used as a variable rather than a constant, which was more disorienting than a flat prohibition on rest would have been. She ran on 4 hours one night and 9 the next, and 2 the night after that. And she began to understand that the randomness was the test, that the ability to perform when the conditions were unpredictable was the specific quality being measured. She did not falter. On day 4, the candidate to her left, a former ranger named Calloway, who was technically excellent and physically formidable, and who had in the first 3 days established himself as the consensus frontrunner, failed a stress inoculation exercise by making a decision 3 seconds late. Not wrong, late. Volk had made a note and said nothing, and Calloway had spent the rest of the day with the particular expression of a man who understood that the note existed and could not unexist it. She saw this and filed it. 3 seconds. The difference between correct and timely was not semantic. It was operational. On day 6 at 2300 hours, Volk appeared in the barracks with no announcement and handed each candidate a sealed envelope and said, "You have 4 minutes. Open it, read it, make a decision. Tell me the decision and your reasoning. Go." She opened the envelope. Inside was a scenario, a 3-person overwatch team, compromised position, 2 possible extraction routes with incomplete information on each, 1 team member injured, communication with support intermittent. Choose a route and justify the choice under the available information. She read it once. She thought for 90 seconds. She told Volk her choice and gave him 4 sentences of reasoning. He wrote something, moved to the next candidate. Later, she would find out that there was no correct answer. The scenario was designed to have 2 equally defensible options. What Volk was measuring was not the choice, but the confidence and clarity of the reasoning. Whether the candidate committed fully to a position under incomplete information or hedged with qualifications that would cost time in a real situation. She had not hedged. On day 8, 2 candidates were released. Neither of them was Calloway. Neither was she. 12 remained. The second week introduced the rifle work, and this was where she understood the full value of what Sullivan had given her in those quiet sessions at Griffin. The technical baseline that the program built from was precisely the foundation Sullivan had described, and she arrived at each instruction point having already thought through the principles being introduced, which meant she could absorb the refinements and applications without the resistance of encountering a concept for the first time. The primary rifle instructor was a staff sergeant named Hayward, who had a different quality from Volk. Quieter, more observational, with the economy of attention of someone who processes information continuously and speaks only when the information has been fully sorted. On the second day of rifle work, he watched her on the range for 40 minutes without comment. When the session ended and the other candidates were cleaning weapons, he stopped beside her bench and said, without preamble, "Who worked with you before you came here?" "Seal Sullivan," she said, informally. "How long?" 6 sessions, maybe 12 hours total. Hayward was quiet for a moment. "That's not enough to account for what I'm looking at," he said. "What are you looking at?" He looked at her directly. "Someone who understands what the rifle is trying to do instead of just what the shooter is trying to do," he said. "That's a conceptual distinction that takes most people 2 years to internalize. You came in with it." He paused. "Where does that come from?" She thought about it honestly. "I think about ballistics the same way I think about logistics," she said. "As a system, every variable interacts with every other variable. You don't manage one at a time. You hold all of them simultaneously and look for the state in which they balance." Hayward studied her for a full 10 seconds. Then he wrote something in his notebook and walked away. She went back to cleaning the rifle. That night at 2100, Sullivan called. The satellite connection was better than the one she had used to call her mother. Cleaner, less delay, and his voice came through with a clarity that made him feel closer than a continent away. "Hayward talked to me," he said immediately. She felt something shift in her chest. "He called you?" "He tracked down my contact through Garrett. He wanted to know about our sessions at Griffin." A pause. "What did you say to him on the range today?" She told him. Sullivan was quiet for long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. Then, "He's going to watch you differently now," he said. "Not in a bad way, in the way that instructors watch people who make them reconsider their own frameworks." "Is that a problem?" "It's a responsibility," Sullivan said. "You'll know what I mean by the end of week 2. She filed it. He was right about the end of week 2. On day 13, Volk ran a full scenario exercise that combined the physical and technical components for the first time. A 4-kilometer movement under load, followed by an immediate precision engagement from an unsupported position. The candidates were given no recovery time between the run and the shot. The point was to test whether the physiological stress of the movement degraded the technical execution of the shot, and by how much, and whether the candidate had developed the control systems to compensate. She had been running load carries every morning at Griffin for 18 days before she left. She had built the specific muscle memory of settling into position while her heart rate was elevated and her breathing was labored, and her hands wanted to shake from exertion. Sullivan had described this requirement in the primer. She had trained for it specifically. She made the shot, first round, clean. 3 candidates did not. 2 of those 3 were released the following morning. 10 remained. At the end of week 2, Volk called her into his office, a plain room with a desk and 2 chairs and nothing on the walls, and sat across from her with his hands flat on the desk and said, "You're leading the cohort." She kept her expression neutral. "I'm focused on my own performance, Sergeant." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you anyway because leaders need to know their position in order to lead from it effectively." He paused. At some point in this program, candidates who are leading the cohort become a specific kind of target. Other candidates push harder against them. Some instructors add pressure specifically to test whether the performance holds when everyone is watching. He looked at her steadily. "It will get harder, not as a punishment, as a confirmation." "I understand," she said. "Do you? You need to know that what I've done so far is not a performance I can maintain under additional pressure," she said. "You need to know whether it's structural or situational. Harder circumstances are the only way to tell." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said simply. She walked out of his office and went back to the barracks and did not tell any of the other candidates what had been said, because there was nothing useful in the telling, and there was everything useful in the focus. That night she reread Sullivan's primer from the beginning, not because she needed the information, because she needed to remember why she was here and who had believed in her before the program had a single data point, and what she had promised herself standing at the perimeter of Griffin, looking at the mountains that didn't move for anyone. Week 3 was the crucible. Volk had not exaggerated. The pressure increased in ways that were systematic and precise, and she understood now what Sullivan had warned her about: the program's ability to find the specific load that would make a person's framework bend. Not break necessarily, bend. And the bending was the data. On day 16, during a night navigation exercise, she made a calculation error that cost her 4 minutes. 4 minutes that moved her from first in the exercise to third. She corrected it and finished, and the correction was clean and fast and completely without the spiral of self-recrimination that she had watched take other candidates out of their focus when things went wrong. Volk noted the error. He also noted the recovery. On day 17, Calloway, who was still in the program and who was genuinely excellent, she had come to understand, in the specific way of a person who is excellent at everything he has been trained for, fell into step beside her after a range session and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," she said. "The Panjwai engagement," he said. "I read the summary in your packet. Moving vehicle shot at 470 meters with an unfamiliar system under direct fire." He paused. "How?" She looked at him. He was asking honestly, not to challenge, not to diminish. He genuinely wanted to understand. "I was running the truck's movement as a variable in a system," she said, "not as a target. I was looking for the state where all the variables balanced: speed, deceleration on terrain, distance, drop at that range, and I aimed for the state, not the truck." He thought about that for a long time as they walked. "That's not how we're taught to think about it," he said finally. "I know," she said. "It might be how we should be." He was quiet again. Then, "You're going to finish this program," he said, not as a compliment, as an observation. The observation of someone who recognized inevitability when it was standing in front of him. "So are you," she said. He nodded, and something between them settled into the particular mutual respect of two serious people who have recognized that the other belongs in the same room. On day 19, the twist came from a direction she had not anticipated. Garrett called. Not a routine update. He called at 0600 on a training day, which meant he had something that couldn't wait for a convenient time, and his voice had the specific, controlled quality she had learned to read as significant information being delivered with care. "Sullivan's being reassigned," he said. She stopped walking. "What?" "Effective in 6 weeks. The element is moving to a new operational area. He's cleared for return to duty, and he's going with us." A pause. "I wanted you to hear it from me before the paperwork reached you." She stood very still. She processed it. Sullivan had said, "If you're in the pipeline by then, there are ways to structure the overlap." He had been talking about the training sessions, the continuation of what they had started at Griffin, the architecture he had been building around her development. 6 weeks. She was 3 weeks into a program that had 2 more phases. "What does that mean for the continuation program?" she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. "It means the formal continuation component shifts to a different structure," Garrett said. "Sullivan's already submitted a full, written curriculum to Hayward. Everything he was going to do with you in person, he's put into a document that Hayward has agreed to administer." Another pause. "He did it before the reassignment came down. He was building it anyway. It's not incomplete, it's everything." She let that land. She let herself feel the specific weight of a person who has spent significant energy preparing something for you, regardless of whether they would ever be present to see you use it. "Is he okay with it?" she asked. "The reassignment?" "Sullivan goes where the mission goes," Garrett said. "You know that. But he asked me to tell you something." A pause that was longer than his pauses usually were. He said, "She doesn't need me to be there. She only needed me to believe it first. Now she believes it. The rest is hers." She was quiet for a full 30 seconds. "Tell him," she started. "He knows," Garrett said. She went back to training. The knowledge of Sullivan's reassignment did something to her that she had not expected. It did not diminish her. It concentrated her. The thin remaining thread of the idea that she was still partly tethered to the circumstances that had created her, the helicopter, the berm, the specific accident of being in the right place with the right wiring on the worst possible day, that thread snapped clean, and what was left was just her, in a barracks at Fort Bragg, leading a cohort of 9 remaining candidates through a program that was designed to find the floor of her capability, and she was going to make sure they never found it. On day 21, 3 weeks in, Volk ran what the program called a convergence exercise. All components simultaneously: movement, communication, precision engagement, decision-making under real-time information change, team coordination with candidates she had not been partnered with before. The exercise was designed to be failed in at least 2 of the 5 component areas. The design assumption was that no candidate could hold all 5 simultaneously under the full pressure of the 3rd week. She held 4 of them perfectly and compensated for the 5th, a communication timing issue caused by equipment, not error, in real time, adapting the engagement plan without breaking the other 4 components. When the exercise ended, Hayward was standing 20 meters away, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the observation face, not the assessment face, something different, something that in a less self-contained person would have been open admiration. He walked over and said one sentence: "Sullivan was right about you." She didn't know what Sullivan had said to him. She didn't ask. She filed the sentence in the permanent place and moved on. On day 23, 2 more candidates were released. 8 remained. On day 25, 1 more. 7. Calloway made it. She was glad about that. The final evaluation happened on day 28, and Volk told them the night before with a flatness that was its own form of respect. Tomorrow is what you came here for. Everything before this has been preparation. Tomorrow is the actual question. Get rest. She lay in the dark for an hour before she slept, and in that hour she did something she had not allowed herself to do in 28 days. She went back to the valley in Panjwai, not with regret, not with guilt, not with the searching quality of someone looking for something to feel bad about. She went back with clarity. She walked through every decision, every round, every moment in which the situation had demanded something from her, and she had given it without flinching. She had been 24 years old and a logistics specialist, and she had picked up a dead man's rifle and held a perimeter that should have collapsed and kept a team alive that should have died. And the reason she had been able to do it was not luck, and not adrenaline, and not some mysterious gift she hadn't known she had. The reason was simpler and harder than any of those things. She had done it because she had been present, completely, entirely present, in her body, in her mind, in the specific moment, without the fraction of herself held back in fear or hesitation, or the kind of internal argument that cost the seconds, that cost the lives. That was the thing Torres had named. That was what Sullivan had called aptitude. That was what Garrett had seen in the first 30 seconds of looking at her in the supply depot. Not a talent for shooting, a talent for being entirely herself under conditions that made most people become someone less. She went to sleep. The final evaluation was 9 hours long. She will not describe it in detail because some things are earned in the doing and lose their meaning in the telling. What she will say is this. At the end of the 9th hour, when Volk gathered the 7 remaining candidates and read the results, her name was first. Not tied, first, by a margin that Hayward later told her, with the same quiet directness that characterized everything he said, was the largest first-place margin the program had recorded in 4 years. Calloway was second. He found her afterward and extended his hand and said, "Outstanding." One word, it was enough. Volk dismissed the group with characteristic economy and then said, "Grant, a moment." She waited while the others filed out. He stood in front of her with his hands behind his back, and his expression doing something she had not previously observed it doing, which was softening, fractionally, briefly, like a window opening a quarter inch to let in a single degree of different air. "I've run this program for 12 years, he said. "I have never had a candidate come in with a field engagement on their record from their first deployment outside the wire." He paused. "I have also never had a candidate in the first phase who I believe was going to be better than this program." He held her gaze. "You understand what I mean by that?" She understood. He meant that the program was designed to be the ceiling. He meant that she was going to exceed the ceiling. "What do I do with that?" she asked. "You use the program for what it gives you, and you don't mistake its limits for yours," he said. "The program will certify you. Your ceiling is your own business." He straightened. Dismissed. She walked out into the Carolina afternoon, and the air was sharp and real and entirely present. And she stood there for a moment and thought about a woman who had been counting ammunition rounds in a supply depot 2 months ago, and felt, underneath the competence, the constant pull of something she couldn't name. She could name it now. Not purpose exactly, not destiny, which was a word she had always found too large to carry without dropping. Something more specific than either of those. The exact thing you are built for, recognized and accepted and fully inhabited. The version of yourself that requires all of you and wastes none. She called Sullivan that night. The connection was different. He was already in the new operational area, and the satellite path was longer. And his voice came through in fragments, but the fragments were enough. "Volk told me," he said before she could speak. She had no idea how Volk had reached him, but she was beginning to understand that within this specific world, the people who mattered were connected in ways that didn't appear on any organizational chart. First, she said, a pause. Then, I know, another pause. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. She thought about the supply depot and the clipboard and the rows of pallets and the pull that had no name. She thought about a helicopter going down and a rifle in her hands and 17 rounds fired in a valley in Panjwai. She thought about Sullivan handing her a laptop in a hospital bed and Garrett saying talent like that shouldn't stay behind a supply counter, and Torres saying stay with a specific thing, and Ruiz saying be careful, and her mother's voice coming through static saying the people who make a difference don't wait for permission. Ready, she said. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, and then he said the last thing she expected him to say, delivered with the same steady conviction he brought to every true thing. You were always ready. The rest of us just needed time to find out. She stood in the dark with the phone against her ear and the Carolina night all around her, and something settled inside her that had been in motion for 24 years. Not finished, not complete, but settled, oriented, pointed, aligned with the truest version of the direction she was going. She was Aninssley Grant. She was 24 years old. She had walked onto a helicopter as a logistics specialist and walked off the far side of the hardest day of her life as something the Army did not yet have a proper form to process. She had held a rifle for the first time in combat and found, in the holding of it, not just a weapon but the precise tool her particular kind of mind had been waiting for without knowing it. She had passed the first phase of the pipeline. There were 2 more ahead, and then the certification, and then the operational assignments, and then the long and demanding life of a person who has accepted the full weight of what they are capable of and decided to carry every pound of it. None of that frightened her. All of it was already hers. She hung up the phone and looked at the sky, and the stars were out in the same uncountable numbers they had been over the Afghan desert. The same stars seemed from a different angle. The same universe entirely indifferent to the small, precise fires that burn inside the people moving across its surface. She was one of those fires, and she was burning exactly as bright as she was always going to burn. Not because someone had lit her, because she had refused, in the end, to stay dark. That was the whole of it. That was all of it, and it was more than enough.